She spent 3 days making that cake. 3 days. By hand. Blue frosting. 3 layers. Because her little boy was turning 5, and she wanted everything to be perfect. And then, in front of 35 people, his girlfriend already had her phone recording before the silence even hit. His mother crossed her arms, nodded slowly, and whispered one word. Finally. 34 adults stood there and did nothing. The only person who ran to her was the 5-year-old birthday boy. But here is what none of them knew. Not the husband, not his mother, not the girlfriend smiling behind her phone. The woman standing there with blue frosting dripping down her face. The woman they had just humiliated in front of everyone she had ever welcomed into her home was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the entire American Southeast. And she had walked away from every single penny of it on purpose, years before, because she wanted to be loved for who she was. Stay with me. Because what she did next didn't just change her life. It changed every single life in that yard. And it will change the way you see the quiet woman you think you already know. This is a story about what happens when a woman finally remembers exactly who she is and decides it's time to remind the people who forgot. If that already hit different, you're going to want to stick around for this one. And if someone in your life needs to hear this story today, share it before you even finish watching. Let's get into it.
Here's where it begins. A backyard in southwest Nashville. 35 people, a 3-layer vanilla cake with blue frosting made by hand, and streamers hanging from a pecan tree next to a table with dinosaur napkins. 5 candles were burning in the afternoon sun. The little boy blew them out in one breath, and everyone clapped. Then, in front of every single person there, the boy's father grabbed the back of his wife's head and pushed her face into that cake. It wasn't a shove, not a moment of anger he could later blame on being drunk. It was slow, deliberate, and controlled, like a message being delivered by hand. Blue frosting exploded everywhere. It covered her eyes, her nose, her mouth. Her hands shot out and gripped the table as her body went stiff. The yard went dead silent. And his girlfriend? She raised her phone and hit record, smiling before she even pressed the button. His mother crossed her arms. She nodded slowly to the woman beside her and whispered one word. Finally. 34 adults stood there like statues. Not one person moved. Not one person said a word. Not a single person reached for the woman with blue frosting dripping down her chin. The only one who moved was the birthday boy. He was 5 years old. He launched himself out of his chair and ran across the grass, arms outstretched, stumbling on the bumpy ground. He reached for his mother's face, trying to wipe the frosting away with his little hands. Mommy, I... His voice cracked through the silence like a stone through glass. She slowly lifted her head. She didn't scream. She didn't curse or throw anything at all. She just reached down, picked up her son, and wiped his tears away before she even touched the mess on her own face. Then she walked inside, the screen door closing quietly behind her. Her husband turned back to the party. She's fine, he said. She's always so dramatic. Now, before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you who this woman really was and everything she did about this, you need to understand something. This story doesn't start in that backyard. It starts 12 years earlier in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina on a 400-acre estate. It was a place surrounded by oak trees and morning fog, where a young woman named Claire made a decision that everyone thought was crazy. A decision that would take 10 years, a ruined marriage, a moment on a bathroom floor, and a ballroom filled with just the right people to prove it was the bravest thing she ever did. She had been right that love was worth more than a last name. She was also about to spend the next decade learning exactly how much that belief was going to cost her. Claire Harrington grew up on land that had been in her family for 3 generations. This wasn't flashy new money, the kind on reality shows. This was the old kind. The quiet kind, Rolling green pastures outside Asheville, a stone fountain at the end of the long driveway, and a library with more books than the one downtown. It was the type of wealth that never has to prove anything to anyone, because it has always known what it is. Her father, George Harrington, was the third one to run it. He wore simple clothes and drove a pickup truck with a dent he never fixed. He knew every person working on his land by their first name, their kids' names, and the things that worried them at night. He raised Claire all by himself after her mother, Margaret, died from cancer when Claire was only 7. He taught her to cook. He taught her to tend the garden. He taught her that kindness was a kind of intelligence, and that cruelty was always, without fail, a sign of fear. Every Sunday evening, George and Claire would sit on the back porch, and he would tell her stories about Margaret, how she could walk into a loud room and calm everyone down just by being there, how she could laugh at things that weren't even funny and make them worth laughing at. When Claire turned 8, George sat her down at the kitchen table and put a small jewelry box in front of her. Inside was a thin silver bracelet with a tiny compass charm. It was Margaret's. He said he'd kept it in his pocket since the day she passed. He fastened it around Claire's small wrist and told her, "This compass belonged to your mother. She wore it every day, not because she needed to find her way, but to remember she always had one, no matter how lost things felt. She had a direction, and so do you, Claire Bear, always." Claire never once took that bracelet off, not in 26 years. Then, when Claire turned 22, she made a decision that confused everyone who loved her. She told George she wanted to leave, not the estate, not the family. She wanted to leave the name. She sat at that same kitchen table, the same table where he had given her the compass bracelet. She told him the words she had practiced for months. "Daddy, she said, "I want to be loved for who I am. Not for what I come from, not for the last name or the numbers in an account. I want someone to choose me, just me, and I want to know, for the rest of my life, that it was real." George was quiet for a very long time. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a horse shuffled in its paddock. The October sunlight slanted through the window. Then he finally said, "You know what that's going to cost you?" "Yes, sir." You know there are people in this world, but then, who will see your open heart as an open door?" "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a long moment and then nodded. He set up a trust in her name, untouched and growing silently, and told her, "The door home is always open, Claire Bear, day or night. You never have to explain yourself. You just have to walk through it." She packed one bag. She drove her old Honda Civic across the state line into Nashville. She changed her last name to Whitmore, her mother's maiden name. It felt like carrying her mother with her, quietly. She found a job at a small catering company and rented an apartment with a broken dishwasher and a radiator that knocked every single night at 2 in the morning like a polite ghost, and she was happy in a way she had not expected. The special kind of happiness that comes from building your own ordinary life. Then, 6 months after she arrived, she met Daniel Shaw. Daniel grew up in Clarksville, Tennessee, 45 minutes from Nashville, in a 2-bedroom house that always seemed one bad month away from disaster. His father left when Daniel was 11. His mother, Melissa, raised him and his sister, Sandra, on a waitress's salary, an iron will, and a deep, unshakable belief that her son was destined for more than Clarksville could ever offer. Melissa Shaw loved her son the way some mothers do, completely, exclusively, and at the expense of everyone else in his life. She told him he was exceptional. She told him he was meant for great things. She told him the world owed him that it just hadn't delivered yet. She said it so often, and with such fire that Daniel absorbed it like dry earth absorbs rain, until he couldn't tell her belief from his own. And on the surface, he was charming. Genuinely, he had a quick smile, an easy laugh, the kind of man who could make anyone feel like they were the only person in the room. He was the kind of guy who seemed like the most interesting person in any room. By 24, he landed a job at a luxury car dealership in Nashville, and he was a natural. We're talking very good. He was pulling commission checks that felt like proof of everything his mother had always told him. I met him at a farmer's market on a sunny Saturday morning in April. I was buying peaches, and he was pretending to look at jars of honey, trying to figure out how to talk to me. I saw right through it. I smiled and said, "The clover honey is better than it looks." He laughed and admitted he'd been standing there for 4 minutes trying to think of something smart to say. I liked his honesty. In my experience, real honesty was a lot rarer than people let on. We stood there and talked for 2 hours next to a table of jams and preserves. He called me that night, and I answered. He called again the next day. He was funny and so warm, and he talked about his dreams with this incredible energy that felt like actual sunshine. He wanted to open his own car dealership one day, to build something real from the ground up. He spoke about his mother with a kind of devotion that I, having adored my own father, found incredibly moving. I had no idea back then what that devotion would end up costing me. We dated for 14 months. He proposed on the back porch of my little apartment. The ring was something he had saved up for 8 long months to buy. He got down on one knee, and I said yes before he could even finish the sentence. We had a small wedding in the Tennessee hills with just 30 people. I wore my mother's dress, and that compass bracelet was on my wrist when I said, "I do." I really thought I had found everything I had left Asheville to find, and I wasn't wrong about that moment. I was just wrong about how long that perfect moment would last. The first 2 years were good. Not perfect, of course. Nothing real ever is. But they were genuinely good. We bought a house in a quiet neighborhood in southwest Nashville. It was modest and clean, with a nice backyard. There was a big pecan tree out back that dropped nuts every single October. I planted a little garden along the south fence with tomatoes, basil, and zucchini. Daniel would tease me about it, but then he'd eat every single thing I grew without a single complaint. Our son, Cooper, was born 14 months after the wedding. Daniel actually cried in the delivery room, real unashamed tears, the kind men cry when something huge happens and they forget they're supposed to be tough. He held our son for the first hour and just refused to put him down. Watching him, I thought, this is what I came here for. I wasn't wrong about that moment either. I was just wrong about what years and money and his mother's voice would do to it. The shift started in year 3. Daniel got a promotion to senior sales, then floor supervisor, and then sales manager just 8 months after that. His commission checks didn't just double, they tripled. He bought a brand new truck. He joined a fancy gym in Green Hills that cost $400 a month. He started wearing a different cologne. Suddenly, he cared about the labels on his shirts in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with the shirts themselves. Now, none of those things are bad on their own, but I noticed something else simmering underneath. It was a restlessness, a deep dissatisfaction that wasn't about what he had, but about what he now thought he deserved. He started coming home later and later. The little texts throughout the day just stopped. Where he once would have sent me a photo of a funny bumper sticker in the parking lot, now entire days would go by without a single word. He started responding to things I said with a pause, a hesitation that was just a fraction of a second too long. It's a very specific pause, the kind a man makes when he's deciding if your thoughts are even worth his time. I noticed all of it. I kept a quiet record of it in my head, the way smart women track the small tremors before the big earthquake, just hoping they're wrong, hoping the ground will settle back down. Then, his mother, Melissa, started coming around more. Melissa Shaw had never liked me, not from the very first Sunday dinner Daniel brought me home to Clarksville. She took one look at me, at my quiet personality, my simple clothes, the silver bracelet on my wrist, the way I listened more than I talked. And she made up her mind in the first 5 minutes. I was not good enough for her son, and so she began, slowly and systematically, to fill Daniel's head with that idea. It happened every Sunday after church, every holiday dinner, every phone call that Daniel would take in the other room that always went on 20 minutes too long. "Baby, she is holding you back," she'd say. "A man of your stature needs a partner who can match him. You've outgrown this. I just worry that you settled." His sister Sandra repeated everything Melissa said, making it even louder, the way younger siblings sometimes do. It was casual cruelty disguised as concern. Once at a family dinner, Sandra said it right in front of me while I was passing the breadbasket. "You could do so much better, Daniel. You know it too." Not a single person acknowledged I was standing 3 feet away. Nobody even flinched. And Daniel said nothing to defend me. That was the moment I finally understood that in his family, silence was not neutral. Silence was agreement. It was a Wednesday in February, the 4th year of our marriage. I spent the whole afternoon making Daniel's favorite meal, braised short ribs with rosemary roasted potatoes. It was the recipe he once told me was the best thing he had ever tasted. I put Cooper to bed early, set the table with candles, and opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving for a special occasion. I decided that a Wednesday, when my marriage desperately needed some warmth, counted as special enough. I sat down at 7 o'clock and waited. At 8, I moved the dinner into the oven to keep it warm. By 9:30, I had to blow out the candles because the wax was dripping all over the tablecloth. Daniel finally walked in at 11:47. He smelled like a restaurant I had never been to. His tie was loose. He looked at the table, the food covered in foil, the candles melted into puddles, the wine sitting untouched on the counter, and all he said was, "I already ate." Then he walked right past me and went upstairs. I just sat at that table for 30 minutes. After I heard the bedroom door close, then I wrapped up the food, washed every dish by hand, folded the tablecloth, and put the wine away. I didn't cry. Until I was in the downstairs bathroom with the water running, loud enough so no one could hear the sound. Now, this is where I want to pause for a second and talk directly to you, because some of you are already doing the mental calculation. You're thinking, why didn't she leave? Why didn't she say something? Why didn't she fight back right then and there? And I want to give you a truly honest answer because it's one of the most important things you'll hear. She loved him. And love, the real kind, the kind you build your entire life around. It doesn't just die on a Wednesday night because the man you gave your heart to came home late smelling like somebody else's restaurant. It dies slowly. It dies in tiny pieces, in a long series of small betrayals that, when you look at them one by one, seem like things you can explain away. Each one feels survivable. And the cruel truth about that kind of slow emotional erosion is that by the time you can see it for what it is, you are already standing in the rubble. The person you used to be, the one who could have walked away easily, feels like a character from a book you read a long time ago. If you are in that place right now, if any part of that Wednesday night feels painfully familiar, I need you to hear this. Understanding why you stayed is not the same thing as accepting that you have to keep staying. Those are two very different things. About 3 weeks after that empty dinner table, I found a receipt from a florist in Daniel's jacket pocket. It was for a bouquet delivered to an address on Granny White Pike that I didn't recognize. I asked him about it calmly one Sunday morning. He told me I was being paranoid. Then in April, I found a long strand of hair on his passenger seat. It wasn't mine. It was straightened and had the faint scent of a floral perfume I didn't wear. I asked him about it again. This time, he told me I was insecure. In May, I picked up his phone just to check the weather because mine was charging. The screen lit up with a message from a contact saved only as JC. It said, "Last night was exactly what I needed. Thank you for being you." I set the phone back down. My hands were perfectly steady. My heart was not. When Daniel came out of the shower, I asked him about it directly. No gentle lead-in, no trying to soften the blow. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It wasn't guilt, and it wasn't shame. It was a cold, flat annoyance, like I was an interruption to his day that he hadn't planned for. "You need to stop going through my things," he said. "And honestly, Claire, with everything I do for this family, you should be grateful I still come home at all." That sentence right there, I want you to write that sentence down, put a date on it, and keep it somewhere safe. Because that statement isn't just frustration talking. It is not a man having a bad week. It is a statement about how he sees the power dynamic between the two of you. He is telling you that his presence in your life is a gift he can take away, that you owe him gratitude, and that his loyalty is completely optional. When someone hands you a confession that's disguised as cruelty, the smartest thing you can do is hold on to it. I had one real friend in Nashville, Diane Mercer. She was 41, a pediatric nurse at Vanderbilt Children's Hospital, a straight-talking, warm woman. She was the kind of friend who shows up with a casserole before you even have to ask and stays until you're actually okay, not just pretending to be. We had met at a neighborhood block party 3 years before. Diane handed me a plate of deviled eggs and said, "I put way too much mustard in these, and I am not sorry about it." It was the first time I had genuinely laughed in what felt like weeks. It was Diane who called me on a Thursday afternoon in June. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to just listen until I'm finished. Can you do that for me?" "Yes," I said. I saw Daniel's truck parked outside the Riverside Hotel on Tuesday night. I was driving home from a late shift. I just sat there for a minute because I wasn't sure it was his, but then I checked the license plate. She sent me the photograph. It had the license plate, a time stamp of 11:48 p.m. I stared at that photo for a very long time. Then I just said, "Thank you for telling me." I hung up the phone and walked into the kitchen. She made Cooper a grilled cheese sandwich, gave him a bath, and read him 2 whole chapters of his favorite dinosaur book. She tucked him in, kissed his forehead, and just watched him breathe for a moment in the doorway. Then she sat down in the dark at the kitchen table and started making a list. You see, Jessica Caldwell didn't just stumble into Daniel Shaw's life, she marched into it with a detailed blueprint. She was 31 with a calculated style that turned her looks into a weapon. And she was precise, like someone who'd spent years finding the weakest walls in every room she entered. She had done this before. Twice, actually, with 2 other married men. Both of them were insecure about where they stood in the world, and both were easy targets for a woman who could make them feel like the center of the universe. She had taken what she needed from each one, money, connections, a certain lifestyle, and then vanished the second they were no longer useful to her. She never left a forwarding address. She left nothing, because to her, those men were never more than a chapter she fully intended to close. She started at Daniel's car dealership as a finance specialist in January. Within 2 weeks, she knew his schedule by heart. Within a month, she had his undivided attention. She complimented him in ways Claire never did, not because Claire couldn't. It was because Claire never thought a man who truly loved you needed constant applause. But Jessica knew better. She understood that some men don't want a partner. They want an audience. She laughed at his jokes just a little too loudly. She wore dresses specifically designed to be noticed. She'd text him, "Good morning," before Claire's alarm went off, and "good night" long after Claire had fallen asleep. At every turn, she made him feel like the most powerful man in any room she chose for him. What Claire didn't know yet, what nobody knew, was how Jessica found that dealership in the first place. 14 months before she even applied, Jessica Caldwell had attended a church fundraiser in Brentwood. She sat at a table near the back, listening to a woman with a sharp tongue, a pearl necklace, and very strong opinions about her son's marriage. She went on and on about the wrong kind of woman her son had married. That woman, of course, was Melissa Shaw. They had coffee twice after that, and then lunch. Melissa painted a picture of Daniel as a man with incredible potential, being slowly suffocated by the wrong wife. Jessica listened, asked all the right questions, and 3 weeks later, she applied for an open job at the dealership Daniel managed. The following week, Melissa made a single payment of $300 to Jessica's account, and the digital record of that transfer would just sit there on a server for 14 months, waiting. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the 3 weeks after seeing that photograph, Claire quietly gathered her proof. There was the florist receipt, Diane's picture, and bank statements with charges she didn't recognize, dinners at restaurants she'd never been to, a hotel stay charged to their joint account on the very night she was in Asheville visiting her brother, George. She printed a screenshot of the damning text message. She put everything into a single folder, neat, dated, and documented. And she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time: clarity. The kind of clarity that feels like power because you finally have solid ground underneath your feet. On a Sunday morning in late June, with Cooper at Melissa's for the afternoon, she sat Daniel down at the kitchen table and placed the folder squarely between them. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just presented the facts like a woman who knows she is right. Daniel glanced at the folder, flipped through a few pages, then he leaned back in his chair and laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was a genuine one, like she'd just told a hilarious joke. "Claire," he said, "what exactly do you think you're going to do with this?" She told him she was considering her options. He scoffed. "You don't work. You have no money of your own and you have no career. What lawyer is going to take your case with no retainer? I have an income. I have a mother who will testify about what kind of wife you've been, and I have a lawyer who owes me a big favor. So, tell me again, what are you going to do?" She held his gaze and said nothing. He picked up his phone and called Melissa, right there in front of her. "Hey, Mama, can you keep Cooper for a few days? Claire needs some time to get herself together." Melissa arrived in 19 minutes flat. She had Cooper's overnight bag already packed before she even walked through the door. She had clearly been waiting for this call. Claire stood frozen in the entryway and watched Melissa buckle her son into his car seat. Cooper waved from the back window, confused but smiling, because at 5 years old, he didn't understand that some goodbyes are much heavier than they look. The car reversed out of the driveway. Claire stood there for a very long time before she finally closed the door and slid down to the hallway floor, her back pressed against the wall. She finally understood. This wasn't a marriage that was failing. This was a plan being carried out. And she was the only one at the table who hadn't been let in on it. With Cooper gone for the week, Daniel dropped all pretenses. Jessica's car was in the driveway on Tuesday night and again on Thursday. Melissa came over on Friday afternoon, and the three of them sat on the back porch, eating takeout on the very same table Claire had found at a garage sale and had lovingly repainted herself one weekend that spring. That Saturday night, Sandra posted a picture on social media. Family dinner at a steakhouse in Green Hills. There was Daniel, Melissa, Sandra, and Jessica, all tagged at the restaurant, all laughing. No Claire, no Cooper. It was a perfect family portrait, with Claire surgically cut out. Someone from Claire's neighborhood saw it and texted her the screenshot. There was no caption, no explanation, just the image, just the gaping hole where she should have been. Claire called Diane, who came over right away. She found Claire on the kitchen floor, leaning against the cabinets, not crying, just still, in that terrifying way a person gets when they've moved beyond tears into something much quieter and far more dangerous. "I don't know how to fight this, Diane," Claire whispered. "I don't even know what I'm fighting anymore." Diane sat right down on the floor beside her. "Then we figure it out together," she said firmly. "But first, you are going to eat something. You can't fight a war on an empty stomach, and I am not going to let you fall apart before the good part starts." For the first time in days, Claire almost smiled. Almost. Cooper came home 10 days later, and Claire dove into planning his birthday party. She threw herself into it the way she did with everything she loved, completely, with both hands, holding nothing back. She baked a 3-layer vanilla cake with blue frosting, because it was Cooper's favorite color. She hung streamers from the big pecan tree in the backyard. She set up little chairs in a circle for all the kids who were coming. She made a playlist of all his favorite songs. She bought dinosaur paper plates and napkins and even a piñata shaped like a T-Rex that took her 45 minutes to track down online. Everything was simple. Everything was done with love. She invited 35 people, neighbors, parents from Cooper's daycare, and a few of Daniel's coworkers she'd always gotten along with. She spent 3 whole days just on the cake, making sure the frosting was swirled in big circles, exactly the way Cooper loved it. Daniel mentioned he'd invited a few people too. He just failed to mention Jessica. He didn't tell Claire he had informed Jessica that this was her grand entrance, her moment to walk through the front door of their home as if she already owned it. And Claire saw it all happen in slow motion. Jessica arrived in a flowing sundress and giant sunglasses, with a designer bag on one arm and Daniel's hand on the other. Melissa met her right at the gate and gave her a long hug, the kind you give to someone you've been eagerly expecting. Claire was standing by the food table, holding a tray of sandwiches she'd cut into triangles because Cooper was convinced, with the absolute certainty of a 5-year-old, that triangle sandwiches simply tasted better. She set the tray down on the table very slowly. She looked at Jessica, standing in her yard next to her husband, and she finally understood, with chilling clarity, that this wasn't a birthday party. It was a power play. It was a demonstration. And she was the one being demonstrated against. The candles were lit right at 3 in the afternoon. 35 people gathered in the backyard that Claire had decorated with tape and streamers and love. The T-Rex piñata swayed from the pecan tree. The little dinosaur plates were stacked and ready for cake. Cooper stood on a small step stool so he could reach the candles. His face was lit by the glow of 5 tiny flames. His eyes were wide, with that special seriousness only a child has when they know that making a wish is very important business. Claire knelt right beside him, her hand resting on his small back. "Make a wish, sweetheart," she whispered. He squeezed his eyes shut, his whole face wrinkling with the effort of putting all his hope into that one wish. Then he blew, and all 5 candles went out in a single puff. Everyone clapped. Claire smiled, a real smile, the first one all day that didn't feel like work. For one perfect second, it was just a birthday party. Then Daniel stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a big speech. He didn't raise his voice or show any sign of anger. that would have at least been honest. He simply put one hand on the back of Claire's head and pressed her face down into the cake. It wasn't a push, it was a press. Slow, deliberate, with the specific force of a decision already made. The sound was soft, like something breaking underwater. Blue frosting exploded across the tablecloth. It covered her eyes, her bultos, the corners of her mouth. Her hand shot out, gripping the table edge. Palms flat and firm. Her entire body went rigid. The September air felt cold on the back of her neck. The backyard went silent in less than 2 seconds. Jessica raised her phone. She hit record. Before the silence had even fully settled, she was already smiling. Not nervously, not from shock, but with the smug smile of someone watching a plan come together at the exact scheduled moment. Melissa crossed her arms, looked at her son, and nodded once, slowly, the way you nod when something you've been waiting for finally happens. She turned to Sandra and said, quiet enough to be a whisper, but loud enough for everyone to hear, finally. Maybe now she'll understand her place. 34 adults stood frozen. Not a single person moved toward Claire. Not one voice said stop. Not one hand reached out. The only person who moved was Cooper. He screamed, "Mommy!" He launched himself from the step stool, running across the grass with his arms stretched out, stumbling as he reached for her face. His small hands found her cheeks, trying to wipe away what had been done to her. "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy!" His voice cracked through the silence like a line being driven through ice. Claire lifted her head. Blue frosting dripped from her chin, and tears cut clean lines through the icing. She could feel the heat of 35 people standing around her, none of them moving, all of them choosing to be somewhere else in their minds. She didn't scream, she didn't curse, she didn't throw a single thing. She reached down and picked up her son. She wiped his tears first, using the corner of her own sleeve, before she even touched her own face. Then she turned and walked inside, the screen door closing softly behind her. Daniel turned back to the party with the casual ease of a man who has already moved on. "She is fine," he said. "She is always dramatic." Jessica reviewed the video on her phone, sent it to her own number, and smiled at what she saw. Melissa announced to the guests that the party was still going. Sandra helped herself to a slice of the ruined cake, pushing her way to the table. Inside, in the hallway bathroom, Claire locked the door, Cooper still on her hip. His face was buried in her neck, his small body shaking with the effort of a 5-year-old trying to process something his body knew was wrong long before his brain had words for it. She stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror. Blue frosting covered her face like a mask someone else had forced on her. Her mascara had run in dark streaks through the icing. The silver compass bracelet on her wrist was smeared with cake. She cleaned the bracelet first, gently, with the corner of a washcloth, more carefully than she cleaned her own skin. She rubbed the small compass charm until the silver caught the bathroom light again. With a sleeping child on her shoulder, and absolutely nothing in a bank account that someone else had drained. Even then, she knew who she was. The compass bracelet didn't point north because of the silver it was made from. It pointed north because she finally decided to follow it. And that is something that no one, no husband, no mother-in-law, no carefully planned break-in, no viral video, no public statement written by a lawyer at 9 p.m. can take from a woman who has decided to remember her own power. So, before you judge someone's silence, consider what they might be building inside of it. Followed by a laughing emoji. The comments were split. Some thought it was a prank, some called Claire dramatic, and some asked with a special kind of moral outrage. Subscribe to this channel Every week, we bring you stories just like this one. Stories about a quiet strength that doesn't need to announce itself, about consequences that arrive slowly and then all at once, about people who found their way back to themselves when the world gave them every reason not to. Hit the notification bell so you never miss one. And if you have ever been the person in that backyard who stayed still when you should have moved, it is not too late to be different next time. That is the whole point of every story we tell here. I will see you in the next one. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality, enough to take Cooper somewhere safe for the night. She called the automated line. The system read her balance, negative $2,340. She pressed 0 for a representative and waited on hold for 6 minutes, listening to music designed to be calming, which it was not. A man answered. She asked about the balance. He told her there had been a cash advance taken against a credit line attached to her Social Security number 3 weeks prior. A card she had never applied for, never activated, a card she had never once held in her hands. Ma'am, the primary card holder authorized it using your information. His name, Daniel's authorization. She asked how much was on the card. $40,000 in charges. Hotels, jewelry, weekend trips, a spa visit, bill what? The morning after she had driven Cooper to his checkup alone because Daniel had something to do. Designer items shipped to an address that wasn't their house, all in her name, all without her knowledge, all without her signature. She sat down on the bathroom floor. Her son was asleep a foot away, his chest rising and falling in the even rhythm of a child who still trusts the world enough to sleep soundly. She had no money, her credit was destroyed, and her face was all over the internet, covered in birthday cake frosting. The frosting from a cake she had spent 3 days making, and the man who had arranged all of it was downstairs in her backyard with the woman he had chosen instead of her, laughing. Now, this is where I want to stop the story for just a moment. Not to add drama, not to make you feel worse before you feel better, but because I want you to sit with the specific weight of that bathroom floor. A woman with a sleeping child, no money, no plan, and not one person in that backyard who had moved to help her. The world was telling her, in every possible language, that she did not matter. But that was not the end of Claire Harrington's story. That was the floor. And the floor, as it turns out, is exactly where some people discover that's what they are actually built from. Because something happened in that bathroom, in the quiet dark. While her son slept and water dripped from the faucet, she'd forgotten to turn off all the way. Something inside of her that had been very still for a very long time finally stood up. At 3 a.m, Cooper was asleep beside her on the bed, his hand curled around a toy dinosaur. His breathing was slow and steady, the breathing of a child who has cried himself into a deep and deserved rest. Claire lay beside him in the dark with her phone in her hands. She had been staring at it for 40 minutes. She scrolled to a contact she had not dialed in 4 years, not from anger, not from distance, but from the particular kind of pride a woman has when she's made a choice and needs to live fully inside it, without her father's voice reminding her who she used to be, George Harrington. She pressed call. It rang twice. Claire Bear. His voice was exactly the same, unhurried, steady. The voice of a man who has been standing in the same place for a very long time and is not surprised by the weather. She didn't cry. She had cried herself empty weeks before the party. What was left was something flatter, cleaner. Not numb, but resolved. She said, "Dad, I need to tell you everything. And when I'm done, I need you to let me decide what happens next. Not you, me. Can you do that? There was a pause. Yes, he said. Tell me everything. She talked for 90 minutes. She told him all of it. The year of small erosions, the dinners eaten alone, Melissa's campaign of cruelty, Jessica's arrival, the text on the phone, Cooper's bag that was packed before she even made the call, the birthday party, the cake, the video, the bank account. Her voice stayed flat and even the entire time, clear, like a person reading the facts of someone else's case in a courtroom. George listened without interrupting once. When she finished, the line was quiet for 10 full seconds. Then he said, "What do you want, Claire?" Not, "I will handle this." Not, "No one touches my daughter." Not a promise of vengeance dressed up as love. Just, "What do you want?" She said, "I want Cooper safe. I want what he did, with my name documented and addressed through every legal channel available. And I want to walk back into my own life standing up. I am not asking you to fight for me, Daddy. I am asking you to hand me what I need and trust me to use it." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "That is my girl." Harold Pike called Claire directly the following morning. He had been George Harrington's legal counsel for 23 years. He was 64. He had silver hair and spoke in a tone so measured that opposing attorneys often spent the first 10 minutes of any meeting just trying to figure out if he was taking them seriously. He was always taking them seriously. He just saw no reason to perform a sense of urgency. He asked her one question before they began: "What outcome do you want?" Not what you're angry about. What outcome? She told him specifically. Primary custody of Cooper, established before anything else moves forward. The credit fraud documented and reported to the proper authorities, and the video preserved as evidence of emotional abuse for the divorce proceedings. Nothing more. Nothing theatrical. Just the facts, placed in the right rooms with the right amount of weight behind them. Harold took some notes, then said, "Give me 72 hours. He called back in 48. "Mrs. Shaw," he said, "we've pulled Jessica Caldwell's background. The prior pattern of 2 previous relationships is documented and usable. But there is something else." He paused, the kind of pause that means what's coming next will change everything. "Miss Caldwell and your mother-in-law, Melissa Shaw, have a documented relationship. It predates Miss Caldwell's job at the dealership by 14 months. We have phone records and a financial transaction. Miss Shaw made a payment into Miss Caldwell's account about 1 week after Miss Caldwell applied for the job." Claire was silent. "Melissa didn't just tolerate the affair," Harold said. "She started it. She recruited Jessica Caldwell, nurtured that relationship, and then arranged the introduction to your husband. We have all the documentation." Claire sat down slowly in a kitchen chair. She thought about every single Sunday dinner, every whispered smear campaign, every time Melissa had shown up at just the right moment to take Cooper, to plant another seed, to wedge herself into the space between Claire and Daniel. It was like watching someone tend a garden they planned to harvest. She thought about the birthday party, Melissa's folded arms, and that one word, finally. She hadn't been watching her marriage crumble on its own. She had been watching a woman systematically dismantle her family over years, all because she decided long ago that Claire Whitmore wasn't the right woman for her son, and she chose to do something about it. "What do you need from me?" Claire asked. "Nothing yet," Harold said. "Just hang on a little longer." 3 weeks after that birthday party, Daniel Shaw received an invitation on thick cardstock with gold lettering. The Tennessee Business Leadership Summit. Black tie, Grand Hyatt, Nashville. A little note inside indicated he'd been selected for VIP recognition as an outstanding community contributor. He called Jessica from the dealership parking lot the second he read it. "Baby," he said, "we've got a gala." She answered with the exact excitement he had grown to depend on. He bought himself a new tie. He had his shoes resoled. He told Melissa to get her hair done and told Sandra to find something elegant to wear. He had no idea that George Harrington was the event's main sponsor. He'd never had any reason to know that name. He arrived with Jessica on his arm and Melissa by his side and took his spot at the VIP table near the front of the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, a live band playing something soft and tasteful. 300 of the most influential people in Nashville were all in one room. Daniel surveyed the scene with the satisfaction of a man who feels he has finally arrived somewhere worthy of him. Melissa straightened her pearl necklace and said, "This is exactly the life you deserve, baby." Sandra was busy taking pictures for her social media accounts. Nobody mentioned Claire. Nobody even thought about her. She had been erased from the evening before it even started. That afternoon, a garment box had arrived at Diane's house, where Claire and Cooper were staying. Inside was a navy gown, simple and perfectly cut, the kind of dress that doesn't need decoration because the woman wearing it is the main event. There was a note in George's handwriting. It was on a small card tucked into the tissue paper. "You are the compass, Claire Bear. You always were." Diane stood in the doorway of the guest room while Claire got dressed. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "You look like someone who is about to change the ending of a story." Claire fastened the compass bracelet around her wrist. She looked at herself in the mirror. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look angry. She didn't look like a woman staging some dramatic return. She looked like a woman who has walked through enough fire to know that she is not the thing that burns. At the summit, George spoke first. He did not mention Claire by name. He talked about legacy, about the difference between men who build something real and men who spend their lives performing success while quietly destroying the people closest to them. He talked about what it costs a family when power gets confused with cruelty. He spoke without any notes and with the unhurried authority of a man who has never needed a room to like him in order to command it. The room listened with the kind of focused attention people give when they feel the words are aimed at something specific. Then George said, "Tonight, I would like to introduce someone who has shown me more about grace under genuine pressure. Wit! Better than anyone I have known in my 67 years. My daughter." The ballroom doors opened. Claire walked in. Her posture was straight, her eyes were fixed forward. The navy gown, the compass bracelet on her wrist, catching every single light in that room. There was no performance, no expression of victory, just a stillness, a complete and unshakable stillness. It's the kind that comes from a woman who has finally decided she is done being small in spaces that should have always been hers. She didn't even look at Daniel's table. She walked right through the center of that ballroom, and conversations just stopped mid-sentence. Forks were lowered, glasses paused at lips. 300 people went quiet in that special way people do. It's when they sense they are watching something that truly matters. She climbed the steps to the stage. She took her father's hand. She turned and faced the room. Daniel's champagne glass stopped halfway to his mouth. His brain scrambled to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. His wife on that stage, next to that man, the man whose name was on the gold lettering of the invitation sitting in Daniel's breast pocket right now. Jessica's hand slid off his arm. Her smile didn't fade. It collapsed all at once, like a building with no support. Melissa gripped the tablecloth with both hands. Her knuckles went white. The pearl necklace she had bought on credit suddenly felt, in that moment, very heavy and very small. Sandra lowered her phone. For the first time all night, Claire stepped up and took the microphone from her father. She held it steady. Her voice didn't shake. She didn't raise it. She didn't have to. "I want to tell you a story," she said, "about a woman who had everything and gave it all up. Not because she was forced to, and not because she was naive, but because she believed with her whole heart that love was worth more than a last name. That being chosen for who you are is worth more than being valued for what you come from." She told all of it, the choice to leave Asheville, the farmer's market, the man who pretended to look at Honey for 4 minutes because he couldn't figure out how to start a conversation with her, the wedding in the Tennessee hills in her mother's dress, the compass bracelet on her wrist as she said, "I do." The dinners she ate alone, the candles that melted down before he ever came home, the receipts, the strand of hair, the text message, being told she should be grateful he still came home at all. Her son's overnight bag that was packed and waiting before the phone call was even made to come get him. "3 weeks ago," she said, "I stood in my backyard at my son's 5th birthday party. I had spent 3 days making a cake. Blue frosting, 3 layers. My little boy blew out the candles. Yeah. And then my husband grabbed the back of my head and pressed my face into that cake, slowly and deliberately, in front of every person I had invited into our home." The room held its breath. His girlfriend recorded it on her phone. She was smiling before she even hit record. His mother crossed her arms, nodded, and said loudly enough for me to hear, "Finally, maybe now she will understand her place." And not one single adult in that yard moved. She paused for 5 full seconds of silence. "The only person who came to me was my 5-year-old son. He ran across the yard with both arms out, screaming my name." She let that sink in. "That woman is me." She didn't point. She didn't need to. Every head in that room swiveled toward Daniel's table. He just sat there, frozen, his jaw locked, his eyes wide, with the unique fear of a man who just realized the ground he built his entire life on was never his to begin with. Behind Claire, a screen lit up. The video played, 47 seconds, in a room full of 300 people who now knew exactly who her father was, who understood the full weight of what they were seeing. Every second of that footage landed like a verdict, finally delivered in the right room. No one laughed. Harold Pike stepped to a second microphone. He was calm, professional. His voice carried without being raised. He announced the formal documentation of credit fraud totaling $40,000, which was opened in Claire Shaw's name without her knowledge or consent. He confirmed that legal proceedings had been initiated with the Tennessee Attorney General. He noted that the property Daniel Shaw currently occupied had always been held in a Harrington family trust, and that his right to live there had been formally revoked that evening. Then he said, "Additionally, we have obtained documentation confirming that the introduction between Daniel Shaw and Jessica Caldwell was deliberately arranged by Melissa Shaw, 14 months prior to Miss Caldwell's employment at the dealership, and was accompanied by a documented financial payment. This was intentional, it is documented, and it will be presented in full during the civil proceedings." The room went completely still. Melissa stood up from her chair, one hand pressed flat on the table. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Daniel turned to look at his mother. She just sat back down. He reached under the table for Jessica's hand, but it wasn't there. Jessica was already composing a text on her phone, not to Daniel, not about Daniel. She had identified her next target 3 weeks ago and was already managing her exit with the calm efficiency of someone who has done this enough times to have a system. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't even look at him. In that one single moment, she became someone who had already left the room. Claire set the microphone down gently on the podium. She kissed her father on the cheek and walked off the stage with that same slow, steady calm she'd walked in with. She never once looked back. The crowd just parted for her, like the ocean making way for the tide. Daniel Shaw got served with legal papers at the car dealership on Monday morning. It happened right there in the parking lot, in front of 3 coworkers who stood in his own backyard 3 weeks earlier. They watched his wife walk inside, alone with cake on her face, and they didn't say a single word. They didn't look at him the same way anymore. Now they looked at him with that special kind of awkwardness, the discomfort of people who know they've made a choice they can't take back. People who spent the last few weeks quietly rewriting the story in their heads, just so their silence feels a little more like the right thing to do. His manager called him into the office. He told him the video, which was now seen in a whole new light because of the summit and George Harrington's name and the fraud proof that 2 local news stations picked up, had gone viral again. This time, with all the details. The company had to protect its image. He was being put on indefinite, unpaid leave, and it started right now. Daniel drove home. The locks were changed. His clothes were packed in boxes on the front porch, neatly folded. Even his shirts were folded just right. The collar was tucked. The sleeves were pressed flat, exactly the way Claire had taught him. It was at the farmer's market on their 3rd date. She had laughed at how terribly he was folding a shirt, and then she showed him the right way. That tiny detail broke something inside him more than any legal paper ever could. He called her phone, voicemail. He called again, voicemail. Her voice on the recording was just so calm, completely untroubled. It was the voice of a woman who had already crossed over to the other side of something he was just now starting to fall into. He drove over to Jessica's apartment building and buzzed her unit. No answer. He buzzed again. He slipped inside and found the building manager, who told him everything. Miss Caldwell had moved out 4 days ago. The place was totally cleared out. No forwarding address, not a single piece of furniture left behind. Not even a scent in the air. She had left nothing, because to her, Daniel Shaw had always been nothing. He was just a chapter in a book she had already finished reading. He ended up sitting in a Walgreens parking lot, with the engine off, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He just stared at nothing for a very, very long time, and then it hit him. Not slowly, but all at once, like a giant wave that had been building in an ocean he never even bothered to look at. He finally understood what he had lost. It wasn't the house he never really owned. It wasn't the money or the status. It was her. The woman who would wake up at 4 a.m. to bake a birthday cake for his son, just because she wanted everything to be perfect. The woman who set the table with candles on a regular Wednesday for no other reason than she loved him. The one who greeted every single guest with real warmth, even the ones who treated her like she was part of the furniture. The woman who would touch a silver bracelet for courage and never once told him what it meant. The woman whose father could buy every car dealership in the entire state, and she never, ever said a word about it. She had loved him that much. She had trusted him with her entire world. And he had thrown it all away for a woman who was already typing her breakup text before she even walked out the door. Meanwhile, Melissa stopped going to her church. After the summit, 3 members of the congregation cornered her in the parking lot. Her Sunday school class quietly gave her duties to someone else. She stopped hosting the big holiday dinners. She stopped her daily calls to Sandra. She just sat in her kitchen in Clarksville for a long time after Daniel confronted her. The house was completely silent for the first time in 30 years of building her son into a man that only existed in her stories. Melissa Shaw had absolutely nothing left to say. As for Sandra's Instagram post, that picture at the steakhouse, it had been screenshotted long before she could delete it. And screenshots live a lot longer than regret does. Her boss called her in for a little talk about company values. She deleted all her social media accounts, but the digital proof was already out there. It had been woven into the internet, just like thread gets woven into a piece of cloth. It was part of the fabric now. It wasn't going anywhere. Jessica showed up again 6 months later in Memphis. Different city, different man, but the same old plan. The same patience, the same practiced warmth, all aimed directly at the right kind of weaknesses. But Harold Pike's office was expecting it. He had already sent the complete file to a family law attorney in Memphis. He did it at the request of that new man's wife, who had found them through a quiet network. A network Claire had helped start after she got back to Asheville. Claire never made a big announcement about it. She never advertised it. She just made herself available to other women who needed what she once needed, alone on a bathroom floor at 3 in the morning. Someone to hand them the right tool for the job and then just step away. 2 weeks after the summit, Claire packed up her and Cooper's belongings into her old Honda Civic. It was the same car she had driven into Nashville 11 years before, back when she was just 22 years old. All she had was one bag, a compass bracelet, and the idea that love was worth more than a family name. Cooper sat in the back seat with his toy dinosaur. His sneakers were on the wrong feet because he had insisted on doing it all by himself, and she just didn't have the heart to tell him he was wrong. He fell asleep somewhere in the foothills. His head was tilted against the car window, his little chest rising and falling with the easy breath of a child who still trusts the world completely. Claire drove through the Blue Ridge Mountains as the sun started to rise over the peaks. The light streamed through the trees in long, golden stripes. The road twisted and turned through the hills, and she knew every single curve of it. She knew it the way you know something you've carried inside you since you were a child. She touched her compass bracelet just once. She didn't look in the rearview mirror. The estate was exactly how she remembered it. The stone fountain at the end of the long driveway, the oak trees along the east fence turning amber and gold in the October sun, the library, the back porch. That was where George had told her stories about her mother, Margaret, on Sunday nights. Back when she was little enough to believe that the world was mostly good, and that the people in it usually meant well. On his first afternoon there, Cooper ran all through the gardens. He chased a rabbit. He picked a fistful of dandelions and presented them to Claire with the seriousness of someone giving a truly important gift. George put him up on his shoulders and walked the garden paths until it was time for dinner. That evening, Claire and George sat on the back porch with 2 glasses of sweet tea. The October light fell in those long gold bars across the floor. After a long while, Claire finally spoke. "I thought love was supposed to feel like home." George took a slow sip of his tea. He set his glass down on the armrest. He watched Cooper down in the garden below, just a small shape in the fading light, turning dandelions into treasure. Then he turned to his daughter, and he said, "It is Claire Bear. You were just in the wrong house." She smiled a small, real smile. It was the first one in a very long time that hadn't cost her a thing. Cooper turned 6 on a Saturday in October. The kitchen in the Asheville estate was 10 times the size of the one in Nashville. It had marble countertops, double ovens, and windows that let in so much morning light the whole room seemed to glow. The cake was a homemade vanilla sponge. It had 3 layers and blue frosting, all made by Claire's hands on a Friday morning. Cooper sat on the counter, and tried to sneak his finger into the mixing bowl twice. He got caught both times and thought it was the funniest thing in the world. It was never about the kitchen. It was never about the size of the house or the marble countertops or the fancy double ovens. It was about a mother's hands making something sweet for her child. And that part hadn't changed. That would never change. The people sitting around the table were different now. George was at the head. Diane and her husband were across from Claire. Diane had driven up from Nashville with deviled eggs, good wine, and her cheerful refusal to get too sentimental about anything. Harold Pike had sent flowers, which Cooper immediately tried to use in a game with his toy dinosaur that had very confusing rules. Cooper's kindergarten teacher, Beverly, had also come. She was the woman who had called Claire just 6 weeks into the school year to say that Cooper was one of the kindest, most empathetic children she had taught in 14 years. She just thought Claire should know that. These were people who said Claire's name with real warmth, and they meant it. They looked at Cooper and saw him for exactly who he was, a little miracle in dinosaur sneakers. A boy who put his shoes on the wrong feet on purpose, collected dandelions like they were gold, and still believed with all his heart. He believed that wishing on birthday candles was very serious and important work. When the candles were all lit and the room started to sing, Claire stood behind her son with her hands resting gently on his shoulders. He looked up at her, and there was already a smudge of frosting on his finger from the taste he had snuck when he thought she wasn't looking. But she had been watching. She just hadn't said anything. Some things are worth letting happen. "Make a wish, Mommy," he said, and she laughed. A big, slow, unguarded laugh. The kind of laugh that only comes after a woman has walked straight through a fire and discovered on the other side that she was never the thing that was burning. She was the thing that survived. "Baby," she said, "I already got it." He blew out all 6 candles in one single breath. The room just erupted in real applause, from people who meant it, from people who had chosen to be in that room because they wanted to be there, not because they felt obligated. The compass bracelet on her wrist caught the October morning light from the kitchen window, and it glowed like a small, steady star. It was like something that had been pointing true north the entire time, even during all those years when she wasn't quite ready to follow it. She had followed it now. So, what did this story teach me? Before we go, I want to talk to you directly for a moment, not as a storyteller finishing up a drama. I've been sitting with Claire's story, really thinking about what it all means, and it taught me 5 powerful things that I believe are worth saying out loud. The first is this: silence is not weakness. There's a specific kind of strength that looks, from the outside, exactly like patience. It often gets mistaken for submission and gets exploited by people who think being quiet means you have nothing to say. But Claire was never powerless. She was waiting. Whether she knew it consciously or not, she was waiting for the perfect moment for the truth to be told in the right room, with the right impact to the right people. She didn't fight every single battle as it came up because she understood, on a level deeper than thought, that winning all the small fights would cost her the strength to win the one that truly mattered. She wasn't silent because she was afraid. She was building her case. The second lesson is that love should never require you to become invisible. If the person you are with only accepts a smaller, quieter, more convenient version of you, that is not love. That is control wearing a mask. And it is one of the hardest things in the world to recognize from the inside. That's because the person doing it is usually the one you trusted the most. The cruelty doesn't start off as some big dramatic event. It's quiet, it's gradual. It's a series of small betrayals that each seem manageable. An empty seat at the table, a forgotten holiday greeting, a silence where they should have defended you. Until one day, you're in your own backyard at your child's birthday party, holding a cake you spent 3 days making, And the man who was supposed to choose you shows the entire world exactly how little you mean to him. The third thing, and this is for anyone who has ever stood in that yard and watched something wrong unfold and did nothing. Your silence is a vote. Every time we pick our own comfort over someone else's crisis, every time we stare at our shoes while something terrible happens right in front of us, we cast that vote. We tell the person being hurt, "You are all alone in this." We make the world a little bit colder, and then we tell ourselves it wasn't our job to make it warmer. A 5-year-old boy was the only person in that yard brave enough to run to his mother. Think about that. Think about what that says about the adults standing around him. And the next time you're in a room where you have to choose between comfort and courage, remember that 5-year-old. Be braver. The fourth lesson, your worth is not decided by what someone else does to you. Daniel tried to use Claire's love as a weapon. Melissa tried to engineer her complete erasure from her own family. Jessica treated her entire life like it was just a hallway, something to walk through on her way to a more important room. And through all of that, Claire's worth did not change. Not once. It was always there. It was always hers. It was always real. The only real question was when she would decide to pick it back up for herself. The fifth and final thing, the one I really want you to carry with you, is this. The woman they underestimate today is very often the one they have to answer to tomorrow. Not because she got lucky, and not because her father had resources, but because she never stopped being exactly who she was, even when that cost her everything. Even when she was sitting on a bathroom floor at 3 a.m, with a sleeping child on her shoulder and absolutely nothing in a bank account that someone else had drained. Even then, she knew who she was. The compass bracelet didn't point north because of the silver it was made from. It pointed north because she finally decided to follow it. And that is something that no one, no husband, no mother-in-law, no carefully planned break-in, no viral video, no public statement written by a lawyer at 9 p.m. can take from a woman who has decided to remember her own power. So before you judge someone's silence, consider what they might be building inside of it. And before you underestimate the quiet woman in the room, consider what she might already know that you do not. And if you are that woman right now, if any part of this story felt less like entertainment and more like looking in a mirror, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not at the end of your story. You are at the floor. And the floor, it turns out, is exactly where you find out what you're made of. If this story stayed with you, if Claire's journey felt familiar, or gave you something real to think about, or it reminded you of someone you love, share it. Today. Not tomorrow. Today. Because someone in your life might be on a bathroom floor right now, and they might need to hear that the floor is not the ending. That the quiet woman is not powerless. That the compass still points north, even when everything around it is pure chaos. Subscribe to this channel. Every week we bring you stories just like this one. Stories about a quiet strength that doesn't need to announce itself. About consequences that arrive slowly and then all at once. About people who found their way back to themselves when the world gave them every reason not to. Hit the notification bell so you never miss one. And if you have ever been the person in that backyard who stayed still when you should have moved, it is not too late to be different next time. That is the whole point of every story we tell here. I will see you in the next one. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.
Before you click away, I want to stay here with you for just a little while longer, because Claire's story, the cake, the bathroom floor, the ballroom, the compass bracelet, It isn't just a story about betrayal and revenge. Those are just the surface. Underneath all of it, there are 5 things I've been sitting with since the moment this story ended, and I believe every single one of them is worth carrying with you. So let's talk about them. Slowly. Because they deserve that. The first thing this story taught me is that silence is not the same thing as weakness, and that distinction matters more than most people realize. When Claire sat at a dinner table alone with melted candles and food she had made from love, she didn't explode. She didn't throw things. She didn't make a scene. And for years, the people around her read that stillness as defeat. Daniel read it as control. Melissa read it as permission to keep going. Even some of the people in that backyard probably read it as acceptance. But Claire was never powerless. She was precise. There is a specific kind of strength that looks, from the outside, exactly like patience. It gets mistaken for submission by people who have never had to build something in the dark. She wasn't fighting every small battle because she understood on a level deeper than thought that winning the small fights would cost her everything she needed to win the one that actually mattered. She was quiet because she was building her case. Brick by brick, quietly, in the dark. So the next time someone reads your silence as weakness, let them. Let them get comfortable in that assumption. Because the most dangerous person in any room is not the one who is loudest. It is the one who is patient enough to wait for the right moment and precise enough to use it.